On today's show, power ranking the currently biggest questions for the San Diego Padres and their offseason, and perhaps even providing some answers.
You are Locked On Padres, your daily San Diego Padres podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of the Locked On Padres podcast, which is part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day for Tuesday, October 28th. As always, I'm your host with sometimes the most, Javier Reyes, and I've been covering this team for 6 years now, not just for this podcast, but various other outlets, including JustBaseball.com, chief among them. Today's episode, guys, is brought to you by Gametime. We love Gametime very much. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Go check that out. And go check me out on the socials if you'd like, at Javipeno, JAVIIPENO, Twitter/X, and Blue Sky. And go subscribe, and especially so on the YouTube, where, if you'd like, you can leave your questions or comments in the comment section below, and I will get to them in the mailbag segment, which we might get to today. But for today's episode, guys, very simple. We are doing a little power rankings segment, bit, episode, topic of all the current biggest questions for the Padres, and some of them have answers and some of them don't. And I actually really think that it's important to rank them in order because some of these questions for the Padres then affect the others, right? So like things with Yu Darvish, things with Michael King, things with AJ Preller, those affect what they might do in free agency and vice versa, right? So I think that it's definitely an interesting offseason. Look, every offseason for the Padres is interesting. This is just the past couple have been definitely relatively quiet by Padres standards, obviously. This past offseason, the biggest thing that happened to them in the 2024 offseason was, frankly, losing out on Roki Sasaki, right? Like, that whole storyline was a big deal, and just following every day, all the different alerts we got. And then, of course, we had the signing of Nick Pivetta, right? That was a big deal. The signing of, remember when Jason Hayward at the time was a big deal? I think it was Jason Hayward and Connor Joe were like two signings they did one day, which was like, oh no, and everyone was on DEFCON 1, right? So it's going to be probably a slower offseason than we think, but let's talk about it, right? Let's start with my number one thing, which is an honorable mention. The question that I think was a question only right after the wildcard series, so this doesn't count as part of the power rankings, but it was whether or not AJ Preller would be fired, right? With new management, in terms of the ownership, I should say, with new ownership, with Peter Seidler no longer with us, obviously, rest in peace, there was some questions about how long the leash for Preller would be, but it's been a couple weeks now since the playoff loss, and we've seen Preller give multiple conferences and, answer questions, frankly, and I just think it's very, very abundantly clear that he is not going to be fired, and I don't think he should be. I think that, look, you've made the playoffs 4 out of the last 6 years. Team didn't show up this time in the postseason, but you did your part, right? So I think it's going to be really interesting. Maybe if they're bad this upcoming year, it could become a question, especially if it's because they're unable to get new talent, if they don't have any guys from the farm system, that type of stuff. Maybe, right? If ownership starts to see, hey, we got a bloated salary and you gave up a lot of our future, then maybe. But otherwise, I don't think it's going to happen. And maybe there's a possibility that they're just trying to honor Peter by being like, hey, this was Peter's guy. So for better or worse, that is absolutely what I think I expect to continue. AJ Preller will be the guy. But let's talk about the number one question, right? Power rankings time. We actually have 8 on my list so far. Obvious. And we talked about it a little bit yesterday with Albert Pujols, and we talked about it the week before. And frankly, I feel like every non-player review episode we've done of this show since the playoff elimination is obviously, who is the new manager going to be for this Padres team? That is probably question number 1, or at least the 1A to what will be the 1B/2, which I'll get to soon. But look, it's a bunch of things. They reportedly started the hiring, or I should say the interview process last Monday, right? With bench coach Brian Esposito being one of the people, right? And there's other guys that might have interviewed that we don't fully know about. I haven't seen any new updates necessarily as far as I'm aware. And look, bottom line is I expect that this could be, look, when Mike Shildt was hired, I think that the Shildt hiring what is the only one in the AJ Preller regime, as far as I've been following, right? As far as I've been covering this team, where we at least had an idea. Like, we knew it was Benji Heel, we had Ryan Flaherty, we had Phil Nevin, and then we had Mike Shildt. Like, we knew last year, or I'm sorry, in entering 2023, or following 2023 that was going to be canon. But Bob Melvin, remember, he came out of nowhere, right? Jace Tigler, a little bit out of nowhere, right? So it wouldn't shock me if maybe it's going to be a candidate that we don't know about. But in terms of the names we've heard so far, right, aside from Brian Esposito, Ryan Flaherty, Ruben Niebla, Phil Nevin, Benji Heel, Scott Service, Brandon Hyde, formerly of the Orioles, Albert Pujols, which we talked about yesterday, Carlos Hernandez, former Padres catcher and current broadcaster for the Spanish broadcast, Mark Loretta, current assistant for the Padres and former second baseman, and David Popkins is just like a dream, I think, and I'm going to put him in there only because I imagine that he might start to emerge as a candidate for other people, especially after the World Series is done. Probably not going to hear traction on him since he's currently trying to win a World Series, obviously, so that's what I would expect. But out of that couple, right, like I initially predicted that it would be Scott Service just because of the patterns, right, of it's the same kind of route that Mike Schilt went under, right, getting fired from the org, getting brought on in a special role, and then getting promoted, right? Like, I could see that, especially since he's worked with Preller before. I think that that's the likely I would say he's the odds-on favorite, right? If we were doing the FanDuel betting odds, I would say that he's the odds-on favorite. But I don't know if he's the best one, and I don't know who is better. I don't know who's worse. It's tricky, but that's the big question. And I think that it is going to be very interesting. If they hire Scott Service, frankly, that's like a one episode for me where I'm going to be like, all right, talk about it real quick and that's it. I think it'll be interesting if one of the other candidates that we don't know about, maybe a young person like Ryan Flaherty, maybe Ruben Niebla, because then we would talk about how this could impact the pitching coaching, right? If it's Albert Pujols, that's just such an enormous name to bring on board, right? If it's Carlos Hernandez, that would be a big shocker, right? Mark Loretta would be a little bit boring potentially, right? There's different avenues, but I think that Scott Service is the one that I don't think there's as many more discussions. It's just like, okay, like this is a little bit in tune with what Preller's been doing. So it should be interesting to follow. The second question, I think, for the Padres this offseason, power ranking wise, dare I say the 1B. And it's a question that I've been posing ever since the 2023 season. One, because of how disastrously disappointing they were in 2023. And two, because of how much money they had spent over the last few years and with the passing of Peter Seidler, right? And that is, of course, is this team, number two question, is this team going to spend a decent amount of money, right? More than maybe we expect. I'm not expecting big time, but are they going to be giving out more Pavetta type contracts? Are they going to be able to get someone like Michael King, who we're going to talk about on Friday's episode, actually, which we'll get into later? Who's projected around 3 years, $75 million, according to some sources, right? So what extent exactly are the Padres going to pay? And it can go in either way. I could see a world in which it's like, Javi, don't be dumb. They've been scaling back on payroll for a while now, right? Like ever since Peter's passing, they've been a lot more timid with that. And they also have a big budget to begin with. So you can't hate on them for saying, all right, we maybe don't want to give out a 14-year deal to Kyle Tucker, right? But it also, this is a team that made the playoffs again 4 out of 6 years. It's a rabid fan base that is hungry. They lead at attendance. They made the playoffs again, so you got some extra revenue from that. Ownership might be like, okay, you know what? We're willing to at least give out those little contracts like a Pavetta light, but we're not letting you do Xander again necessarily. And if that's the case, that is big for the Padres, undoubtedly. But before we talk about some other big things for the Padres, I need to take a second to talk to you about one of our sponsors, and that is our friends over at Gametime. NFL season is back! And honestly, there's nothing better than being in the stadium surrounded by fans cheering on your team and, I don't know, getting some snacks, perhaps. But let's be honest, getting tickets can be a hassle. Between queues, login screens, and prices jumping at checkout, it's really, really frustrating, right? And that's why I use Gametime, the app that gives the advantage back to the fans. Gametime is fast, easy, and backed by the Gametime guarantee. You'll always get 100% authentic tickets delivered on time and at the best price. Plus, all fees are included. So the price you see is the price you pay. And it's great. You see amazing deals like instantly whenever you pull it up. NFL games as low as $100. They make it super simple. You can see your seat view. They have zone deal options. And it's just less stressful. That's my best pitch for you guys for Gametime, right? Less stressful than other places, right? So download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply, but again, that's promo code LOCKEDONMLB for $20 off. Swipe, tap, ticket, and go! Download Gametime today. And And just like that, everybody, we are back thriving and vibing into the second segment of this year podcast, power ranking the biggest questions at the moment for the Padres. And I say at the moment because, like, anything can change, right? We could see a big trade happen, and we're going to get to trades in a second. We could see, heck, maybe, right? Like, maybe he could get fired. Who knows? AJ Preller could get fired. And frankly, that would be really funny if I start off the episode saying, hey, this isn't going to happen, and then that immediately happens, which would throw everything off. Again, guys, I don't think it's going to happen. If it was going to happen, it would have happened really soon. But we'll have to see. The next thing, I think, in terms of the third biggest question for me, for the Padres, it might surprise a few people. But for me, is Yu Darvish going to retire? I think there's a human interest side of this that makes it interesting if you're not a Padres fan, and then also obviously a Padres fan, right? There's some obvious like consequences of this. If he were to retire, the free money from that, and also just having a free spot, that could be interesting. Where would he go next? There's been some light sort of vibes and rumors that he might be interested in a position with the team. Right. And they seem to clearly respect and love him. Players like him. He's just this vet. He's really savvy. He's a hard worker. And he has a vibe, which is why a lot of people are saying as such, that he might be the type of player to be like, you know what? If I'm no good anymore, I don't want to just be like this like damaged goods sort of washed up star who's just there and getting paid and looking horrible. You know what I mean? Like, I could see a world when she's like, you know what, I'm good, and I'm going to go to Japan and coach or whatever it is, right? So that's a big question, I think, for the Padres on a variety of fronts. And hey, whatever he decides, he decides. We'll have to see how that pans out. But I do think that is the third biggest question for the Padres at the moment this offseason. And it's going to be genuinely really, really fascinating because I think that Darvish, I do believe that he could still have something left, but let me tell you, just what we saw in the regular season, not very good. And I think that while I think we made a mistake as Padres fans, and even myself included, that we just assumed, you know what, maybe he could turn it on in the playoffs, right? But most of the time, guys, in baseball, it's just kind of not like that. You're not going to become all of a sudden a great pitcher when you had a 5.38 ERA. So we'll have to see how it pans out, but I do think it is a big question. The next question, number 4 on the power ranking for the biggest questions for the Padres this offseason. What are they going to do with Mason Miller? I would actually argue that this is higher. I put Darvish ahead only because of the human interest, just like that's our guy standpoint. I would even make the argument that this could be number 2 on the list, right? So, which is funny. I'm kind of going against my own set of rules for this podcast, but Mason Miller, will they use him as a starter or a bullpen guy? And we're going to do a player review for the entire bullpen for the Padres, so I don't want to step on this too much, right? But look forward to that. First of all, that'll be probably next week. But I think that if you take Mason Miller out of the bullpen, then yeah, there are going to be some questions, right? This Padres bullpen will get worse without Mason Miller. But they also have a lot of guys, and they have a lot of guys that could have potential upside, right? And this is a team that has shown a tendency to get the best out of some bullpen guys. Nobody knew who David Morgan was. He had a higher arm slot. He increases his velocity out of nowhere, and everyone's like, oh, wow, guess we have another one, right? So these things can change really quickly, and I think that the bullpen, if there's one area that you have to hope that you can build throughout the course of the season, that's the area, is bullpen, right? And with the Padres potentially losing both Dylan Cease and Michael King, and maybe even Yu Darvish, your rotation is looking like Nick Pivetta, Joe Musgrove, and then, oh God, what's the rest, right? So it gets a lot more questionable. So whether or not he becomes a starting pitcher, I would imagine that that's something that would be answered by some of their free agent moves or lack thereof, right? If they go hard and they get a couple new starting pitchers in free agency, maybe some lower tier free agents, that might say that they just want to rock Mason Miller in the bullpen because they, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And if they don't, they got to start that early. You can't just try to convert a reliever, you know, in the middle of nothing, right? Like, we're going to have to see how this pans out. It'll be one of the biggest questions for sure come spring training. So that is a big question for me. What are the plans? And we did see that AJ Preller, after acquiring Mason Miller in the press conference right after the trade deadline, did not commit. Right, he kind of did a little bit of a wink for Preller about whether or not they could use him as a starter going forward, which would also support why they gave up such a haul for him and why they were willing to go after him, not just for helpful this year and not just because he's an ace reliever, but also because he might have awesome value as a starting pitcher. And we've seen that as a trend in Major League Baseball with Seth Lugo, with Clay Holmes, with a litany of other players, right? And sometimes the other way around, right? We saw Roki Sasaki go to the bullpen and been awesome for them. But it's definitely a question for the Padres that I'm curious to see how they go about it. Next question is a simple one. Another one that we'll be hearing probably in spring training, but I'm still counting it for sake of this list. Joe Musgrove's rehab, right? He did not pitch this year, but, it's never a guarantee that guys are just going to come right back and be awesome, right? And it's not like Joe Musgrove is a guy like Jacob deGrom. I love Joe Musgrove, but this isn't one of those like all-time, oh my God, best pitcher of the generation. Instead, he's like a top 20-ish pitcher in Major League Baseball, top 25-ish potentially, but probably top 20 if he's right. And he's the guy for the Padres. And I think that having him on this team, having him in this pitching staff, if he's healthy and ready to go, Pivetta and then what's his face? And then Musgrove and then Mason Miller potentially, that's like a pretty decent three-headed start to a rotation depending on what they do elsewhere, at least for the time being, right? That's going to be a really interesting question that I'm looking forward to see. How is his rehab going to go? And I miss him. Joe Musgrove being hurt, and I know that for the Dodgers fans that are still lurking on this video, like, shocker, the Dodgers fans only like complaining about injuries when they happen to them, but this is going to be a big deal. It's the second, I remember in 2020 when the Padres lost Clevenger, who turned out to be bad, but that season, and then Nelson Lamet, they lost their number 2 and 3 starters. Actually, their 1 and 2 starters probably that year ahead of their series against the Dodgers, and it really hurt them. They only had Zach Davies, right? So losing Joe Musgrove, brutal blow last year, brutal blow this year. How is he going to come back? Hopefully pretty decent and great, but we'll have to see. Next question really quickly. It's been brought up. I don't know if it'll happen. And again, it's kind of similar to the thing about AJ Preller, but could the team get a new hitting coach? I think is something to look into. Could they really rework the staff, right? And also, by the way, if Ruben Niebo were to get hired, then who would be the new pitching coach, right? Will they overhaul some of the staff and not just leave it that way, right? Like, I think that is another interesting question for the Padres. Could they replace Schilt with Niebo? Then they have to get a new pitching coach. And then maybe do they just say, all right, screw it, let's get a new batting coach too? How does all that pan out? I think is a big question for the Padres going forward. And I'm very curious to see the answer to it. Next one, Michael King. Is he gone? It's tough. According to Dennis Lin, he's saying the early sort of reports are that they do not think that he's going back to the Padres. I think that it's going to depend on his medicals, something we will be talking about on Friday in our beginning of our many free agent previews. I think that's going to be interesting, and I think that if his medicals aren't great, I do wonder if you even want him back, right? Like it's going to be a whole thing. I would wager, though, based on the vibes, based on the kind of body language, he's probably not coming back to the Padres. I thought they had a chance, but we'll see. Right? Because remember, I brought up after the wild card, I had a lot of questions. Why was it that Michael King in a do or die playoff series was only ready to go 1 inning, despite being a starting pitcher going multiple innings towards the end of the season? It says a lot. So be very, very, very much on the lookout for what happens with his medicals and what have you. It's a big question for the Padres this offseason. And sorry, folks, for the sudden break in the action, but we had to take a break. You guys know how it is. The veterans of this podcast know. It's how we keep the lights on. But let's continue and wind down with this podcast, talking about the biggest questions for the Padres this offseason. My last big question at the moment, Jim Bowden recently wrote for The Athletic that the Padres could be one of the teams inquiring on some of the top trade candidates, right? He listed 10. There's a bunch of them. Alec Boehm is one of them, right? There's tons of them. Bryce Harper is all of a sudden maybe potentially one of them, with the GM voicing displeasure, and then Harper being really upset by it. So there's some drama going on there. But in terms of 2 particular candidates, the Padres were listed by Jim Bowden, and I don't know if I believe this all that much, and I'm going to tell you why in a second, but Freddy Peralta and MacKenzie Gore, right? So and the reason I put this last is because if this was really a possibility, this would be like number 2 or 3, right? Because Freddy Peralta was awesome this year, and MacKenzie Gore started off awesome this year and strikes out a lot of batters, but at the very minimum is young and under control, right? And we did see that the Nationals were potentially shopping him. But I just don't know how the Padres could potentially pull this off. Are there guys in this farm system that fellow prognosticators for baseball, analysts and reporters and beat writers may be undervalued, and maybe secretly the Nationals or the Brewers could want them? We do know that the Brewers are known for trading guys despite having a good season, right? That's what the Milwaukee Brewers do. They kick the can down the road. So I'm not surprised that these 2 are trade candidates potentially. But the Padres, my thing is, they gave up everything this past trade deadline. Do they have enough? Are they going to deal Ethan Salas potentially? If you deal Ethan Salas, it's like you better feel great about Freddy Vermeed or have plans to sign another catcher, right? Because then you're just looking at a situation where you have no farm system left. Does AJ Preller care? Clearly not. But that is going to be a question, and I don't see it. Are these two players the type of team players that are going to get dealt and we're going to be like, wow, that's all that it costs to get these guys? I don't know. And my other thing would be, I just think that if those players are on the market, especially Peralta, there are just other teams with more assets that they could potentially move. I know that there are a lot of coward organizations in this league, but still, I just think that there are more teams there. But nonetheless, it still counts for the questions, for sure. And especially in the case of MacKenzie Gore, for those who don't remember, the Padres were in contact with the Nationals in a real way for MacKenzie Gore. Same thing that they were with Stephen Kwan. Right? There was a lot of players that they were checking in on, but we did hear about MacKenzie Gore, and the fact that they might want to move him is very weird, but we'll see. I just don't know why they would do that right now in their rebuilding era. But again, we'll see, because they clearly want to move him. Maybe he's a personality thing. I don't know. Speculation. But let me just list one more time the biggest questions power ranking for the Padres currently in the offseason. Number 1, who's going to be the new manager? Number 2, will there be a surprise amount of spending? Number 3, Yu Darvish, is he going to retire? Number 4, Mason Miller, will he be a bullpen guy? Will he be a starter converted that way? Joe Musgrove's rehab at number 5. New hitting coaches, potentially. And then potentially, if they hire Ruben Abel, a new pitching coach. And then number 7, is Michael King really gone? What's going on with his medicals? And lastly, Freddy Peralta and MacKenzie Gore being potential trade targets, according to Jim Bowden in The Athletic. We'll just have to see. We'll have to see, guys. We'll have to see. But that is it for the power ranking of the questions. I want to now close out this podcast by finishing up some of the mailbag questions that we have remaining. Remember, you guys can send some comments in the episode comment section on the YouTube. So subscribe if you haven't already. We got one question from @ForceDog, who said, get Pasquantino. For those who don't know, Vinny Pasquantino of the Kansas City Royals. Hey, you know me. I am all in on not... Here's what I should say. I will never dismiss teams that don't spend and weren't necessarily very good, or just in general teams that don't spend trading really good players, right? I will never dismiss that. Does it make sense potentially for the Royals to give up a player under control at his age, a really solid first baseman who hit 32 home runs this year? That was really nice, right? Really bad defensive metrics, I will say, but nonetheless, it's the Royals. Like, teams like this tend to do this, and it never makes sense. It will never make sense, but that's how baseball works, guys. A lot of teams just kick the can down the road. But I don't know if I see it, right? But if they did do that, would be awesome. A lot of slug there, right? And he's a fun personality, frankly. I like Vinny P. He's a little centric fellow. He's a little weird. He's a little weirdy, but I like him. But I just don't see it for the Royals right now, right? Like, are they really just going to start selling off guys? Again, they would do it. They could absolutely do it. Look at, again, Freddy Peralta is literally in trade rumors. That team won like 97 games this year. Like, that's crazy. I hate the Brewers, but can they do it? Can they get Vinny Pasquantino? Maybe if the Royals don't value him highly, maybe, and you get him under control, that would be a proper first baseman for this team. Then all you're missing is second base, potentially. Or not really, actually, because you have Jake Cronenworth. What am I saying? So we'll see. We'll have to see how it breaks down. Next comment, though, comes by way of SNI6941. Last year, the Padres' best hitter was Profar. They let him go. The Cubs, they have 330 home run hitters, 320 home run hitters, and even Carson Kelly hit 17 and Shaw hit 13. So the Cubs basically only have one player in the lineup that is not a home run threat, or mostly two, versus the Padres, who only have 4 players. Cubs hit 70 more home runs than the Padres, and postseason baseball is all about home runs and the offense, because the opposing pitching strategy will not allow you to string multiple hits together. I think bro cooked here. But I bring this up because it is going to be important. The Padres need to add, I don't even care if it's a flawed power, i.e., look at what they did with Gavin Sheets, right? Those are the type of players that they should find. Guys that can hit for power, even if they have low on-base numbers, even if they swing and miss on a lot, and they could go on really disastrous bad streaks. Look how many players on the Padres consistently got on base via the walk or a light single every time. And look how middling their offense was, right? Add some power, because Manny Machado ain't getting any younger. Jackson Merrill, he's got some power, but still, do you want to bet and guarantee that a young player like that is going to be the one who carries you offensively? Tatis might not be the power hitter, Ken Griffey Jr. archetype that we thought he'd be. And then you've got Gavin Sheets. Laureano, right? It gets pretty tough. So I think overall, absolutely, looking for home run power hitters is going to be a big thing for the Padres this offseason. Some trolls, Evelyn Ayala S4R says, Javier, what good has your team accomplished in the last 2 years? Love listening to your show. It's very funny. Your team is dysfunctional and will never win. This is what I love about the Dodger fans is like, guys, when you make fun of the Padres and say that they're very bad and they haven't accomplished anything, it's like, we know. That's why we hope to win. Like, this idea that, like, the Padres fans should never celebrate or the Padres fans should never have hopes, right? It comes from a place of such snobbery and stay in your place. Dodger fan here, how dare you want to be good at baseball? It's like, well, then this is why everybody hates you guys. And no one wants to talk about your team because you always, they're like the killjoys of everything, right? I'm not kidding, guys. There are Dodgers media people who I won't name who like making jokes when other teams' fan bases sign a player. It's like, well, then, but then when you guys sign a player, you say, well, you know, don't be jealous that we have money. It's like, then what are we doing here? So Dodger fan base, again, internet-wise, and some of their media is very annoying as ever, but I have a lot of Dodger fans in my life that are also really cool too. But what can I say? But last thing though, hey, Jackie's part of Brooklyn, New York stand-up, all right? That's where I come from. So stop it. Stop claiming. I don't want to see that Buster Olney nonsense tweet again. Another little bit of a hate comment comes from TNO Overland, but unfortunately, he has a decent point. This is what happens, in reference to the playoff loss, when you dump the farm every year for 3 straight years. You get to a point where there is very little depth in the farm and your stars are aging. The Padres maybe have 2 more years of contention, and that will once again require them to keep trading more prospects to supplement the team. Once Manny and Bogarts hit 35, it's going to be a wrap. Look, here's what I'll say about that, is that the Padres have been really good at cultivating the farm. I trust AJ Preller. And secondly, there are other... there's a degree of this comment, maybe, from my guy TN Overload, ostensibly so, that it's like, you should be like those other teams that have a lot of prospects. And I'm like, well, some of those teams, where do they go? Where do the Brewers go? Where do the Guardians go? Where do the Rays go? Right? Where do the Royals go? So let's not act like the Padres strategy is 100% bad. I have my issues with it. I do, absolutely. But let's stop acting like the trading of the prospects is the only reason they're not winning. Right? There are other teams that have a lot of prospects that don't do anything either. It's like the Padres have a problem in one direction or the other, sure, but you can't ignore the downside of always hoarding your prospects either. So that would be my take on that. Last thing, though, this one coming by way of Subaru. He says, imagine being Javi changing fandom from the Yankees to the Padres at the height of the bandwagon. LOL. Has to be the biggest regret ever. I like it that the Dodgers fans are like, what have you ever won? You don't win World Series. And it's like, well, the Yankees last won in 2009. And haven't really talked about this in a while. I recommend looking up Chicago White Sox. I did like a White Sox SB Nation interview a while back about just like upcoming teams that the White Sox were playing, interviewing them. And I've talked about this before on some other shows that I can't really list off the top of my head since there's been so many, about why I left the Yankees. Breaking news for those who aren't familiar. And I left them for a bunch of reasons. Number one, because this position opened up and I really have an interest in covering up and coming stories in baseball, right? Like, I just thought it was fascinating that the Padres were all of a sudden being a team that wanted to spend and wanted to make big moves and all that sort of stuff. I just genuinely, as a journalist, that's my background. Like, I was just fascinated by that. And I also had some problems with the Yankees culturally, politically, fan base wise, the vibes. It just doesn't, as someone who's in the metropolitan area, it doesn't feel like very New York anymore to me, right? If the Mets feel a lot more New York vibes to me, the Knicks do. It's just, there's something about them that feels like, here's how I'll sum it up. Going to Yankees games, it's like, I feel like I'm going to run into people in $12,000 sports jackets making calls at work. When I go to a Mets game, I feel like I'm running into lunatics who are yelling about how they want Lindor to hit a home run here or whatever. That's just the vibe for me. It's complicated, and maybe I'll share it on another episode, another crossover in the future, but that's my vibe. And with that all being said, everybody, that about does it for today's edition of the Locked On Padres podcast, the only pod that may be better than the Padres themselves. Future episodes. Tomorrow, we are going over a player review, guys. We're doing Xander Bogaerts 2025 in review. And then Thursday, we're doing Jake Cronenworth player in review. And then Friday, for Fun Friday, not a guest this week. Don't worry, we're going to have him back, eventually some guests. But we're going over Jim Bowden's latest article ranking and predicting free agents in baseball. That should be a lot of fun. And then potentially next Tuesday, after the mailbag on Monday, we're doing the bullpen and review. Look at that. I mapped out everything for you guys. Don't say I didn't do anything for you, all right? Keep that in mind. But until next time, stay safe and, of course, stay faithful. My Friday faithful homies, take care.